Good evening, or good afternoon, whatever it is. So, thank you for coming, and for our gathering tonight as we begin discussions within our congregation about the future and direction of our United Methodist Church. And, this is something that has been before us for years, and something that we may have heard some things, and we may have wondered about things, or maybe we haven't heard anything at all, and when these meetings were announced, we're going, what? Well, we've come to that point in that time in our history that we need to have some discussion and dialogue and understanding of what's before us. So this is why we're here tonight. And I want to have a prayer, and then I want to give an introduction for our guest who has graciously come to help us get an understanding of our United Methodist Church and what is lying ahead for us in February of 2019. So, let's pray. Will you please join me in prayer? Gracious Lord, we thank you for tonight, and we ask that there be a sweet spirit of your presence among us, because you are Lord, and we love you, and you are Lord of your church, and we want your church honored and glorified, and we want to be part of that. And help us to understand what's happening and how we can best respond to that. Thank you for Chris and his life and his love for you, and I pray that your Spirit would be upon him as he gives us some direction and leads us tonight. And so be in the midst of our thinking, our thoughts, our conversation, and we ask all of this in your precious and glorious name. Amen. Okay, some house details here. First of all, on the other side is an youth alpha event going on. So we may hear a little bit of this and that while we're going and doing our thing. I don't know. But when we leave the building, we're all going to go that direction. And we've blocked off the hallway. Like if you're walking down to the pastor's office, exit that door, please. I know some came in this door here, but going this direction puts us squarely in their way. So when we leave, front door or out the doors by pastors' offices, go that direction. There are some snacks out there afterwards. If you want to hang around and have some fellowship time, you're welcome to do that. They're for your enjoyment. There's some water, there's some snacks there as well. And I just want to have a simple evening. We're not going to sing hymns and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to give an introduction. Chris is going to come up and begin to share with you. I want to introduce Chris Ritter for us this evening. He is currently the directing pastor at Geneseo First. And as you know, I have a fondness for the town of Geneseo. And Chris knows I've been at my dad's house there cleaning out, and I showed them, I found 42 years ago the newspaper when Geneseo won the first high school football tournament, 3A. Our theme was on the Bible this morning, and extra, read all about it. And all of a sudden I see this newspaper. I go, I got to share that with my people. But Geneseo is a multi-site ministry. Geneseo and Cambridge are under his leadership. And he had, I can't remember what year your appointment was started there. 2009. So We appreciate your steadfast ministry there in Geneseo. He's also an author of a book titled 7 Things John Wesley Expected Us to Do for Kids. Isn't that awesome? And he's a graduate of Candler School of Theology at Emory University and earned his Doctor of Ministry degree at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University in evangelism. And you can contact Chris through his website, peopleneedjesus. Is it org or com?
Org is the church, net is the blog.
Okay. Org is the church, net is the blog. And he has on there a great gathering of information, a timeline, and articles from varying perspectives throughout this whole process on what is happening in United Methodist Church. He's been kind of a gatekeeper of that for me and for many others in our conference who are trying to wrap our head around what's taking place, and he's been very articulate in that. He's also was a delegate at the 2016 General Conference. We have 5 clergy and 5 laity delegates, and Chris was one of the clergy delegates. And of course, those same delegates will also be represented at the 2016 General Conference, Special General Conference in St. Louis in February of 2019. And his wife, Becky, and he have 4 young adult children, Hannah, Isaac, Sarah, and Samuel. And what I have come to appreciate about Chris is his heart for Jesus in helping people know that he's the most glorious experience you can have on this earth, and that he wants everybody to experience and know Jesus. Thus, people need Jesus. And he loves the church for whom Jesus died. And he's like all of us, is concerned about what this future might be and how it might go. He's written extensively about this, and you're going to hear 3 proposals, and one of the proposals, which kind of tiers 2 or 3 conferences, he has written quite a bit about that, and I think was even at the forefront of that concept for our church to think about. So he's put a lot of thought into things. And when I was considering having something like this, his name was the first name that came to my mind as someone I would love to have come and speak and share with us. So, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you. Now, he's going to have lots of slide presentations up here on a PowerPoint presentation here. He had sent me a PDF of that. Our main copier went down Friday afternoon or Friday late morning and won't be fixed till Monday. But after seeing this tonight, if you would like a copy of that, you're going to have to call the church office, and we can make a copy for you, and you can pick it up, kind of thing. But we just could not get that accomplished tonight. It'll be a number of pages, but it would at least have all the information he's going to be giving here. So, Chris, God bless you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. Bless you. Hey, good evening. When I learned that, we pastors, we watch the appointment list, what pastors get appointed where. And when I saw that Gary and Gabe were coming to Morton United Methodist, I said, I want to join Morton United Methodist Church. I think that would be great. You've got a great team of pastors, and I'm a little jealous what's going on behind me. We do the youth alpha and adult alpha at our church. We really are invested in that. And I almost would rather be on the other side of the wall there talking about talking about Jesus than on this side of the wall talking about denominational issues and problems. But I really appreciate the invitation to be here tonight and share. So when I've done this presentation in my own church, and with question and answer time and pausing for questions, this took 90 minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze that a little bit, but I'm going to try not to go so fast that we miss something important we want to talk about. Just want to set a few ground rules tonight. We're not going to solve all the issues tonight. That's one thing. So we're not here to debate it all and figure it all out because that's really beyond our scope. And we're also not here to debate like homosexuality. One of the reasons why this is such a difficult discussion, your Illinois Great Rivers Conference delegation met yesterday in Springfield. And it was just painful. We disagree on what should happen and it hurts our hearts because all of us have someone we love that's gay, and so it's very personal because it's not just like an abstract issue. It's like we have faces to go along with. It's not an issue; it's people, and our faith is very personal to us. Hopefully, it's not private, but it is very personal. And so it touches on some really deeply held things, the things we're going to talk about tonight. So we're not going to be talking on the level of what should the church do. I'm just going to try to give you some history and some context and the proposals and what to look for. And there'll be ample opportunity for question and answer, that kind of thing. And I know we have some people that are very dyed-in-the-wool, been part of the United Methodist Church for a long, long time here tonight. And I'm going to give you some background on the United Methodist Church. And I don't want to insult your intelligence. You probably know a lot about the denomination. But the things I'm going to lift up, they have to do with why this is such a sticky wicket. And why we just can't say, well, you do what you want to do, and I'll do what I want to do. Why we just can't agree to disagree. I just saw the word agree to disagree, that phrase was coined by John Wesley. Some people don't realize that. Why can't we just agree to disagree? And so we're gonna look at those issues. So I got a little outline. I'm going to put up the next slide. It's just kind of an outline for tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about the United Methodist Church. We're going to talk a little bit about the present crisis. We're going to talk about the proposals that are on the table for General Conference 2019 to address the crisis, and we're going to understand what that might mean a little bit. Okay, so that's where we're going tonight. And let's talk a little bit first of all about the United Methodist Church. Let's go. I think you can advance 2 slides. One more. We're a 50-year-old church. This is our birthday year. The United Methodist Church was formed by a merger of the Evangelical United Brethren Church. 1968, that's an interesting time for a church to be born. It was probably the high water mark of the ecumenical movement, which was, hey, churches ought to come together and we ought to merge. And looking back on the ecumenical movement, some would criticize it as kind of unity by reduction. Let's find the lowest common denominator that we all agree on, and let's kind of get rid of let's kind of smooth out the little individual things, and let's just kind of go on to the big picture thing. So that was very much a movement at that time. And our church, when we merged the Evangelical United Brethren, Gary grew up going to church a block away from the church that I pastor. And people come through town and they say, oh, they must have had a terrible fight at somewhere along the way because you got 2 United Methodist churches a block away from one another. Well, no, they never were the same congregation. Back in 1968, they were the Evangelical United Brethren Church, and we were the Methodist Church, and the denominations merged. And in our book of discipline, rather than try to take the United Methodist Articles of Faith and the Evangelical United Brethren creeds, and not creeds, but they're, what's the word I'm looking for? Articles of, the Methodists are the Articles of Faith, and the Evangelical United Brethren is their faith statement there. And kind of harmonize those. They just printed both of them, and we put a theological method in place that basically, it was an experiment in theological pluralism. Well, we got Scripture, we got reason, we got tradition, we got experience, and we kind of figure our faith out, putting all those things together. So, next slide. This is our roots, though, however, the 19th century battle cry to spread scriptural holiness throughout the land. We were a young insurgent Methodist movement, predominantly Methodist movement, if you take the EUV roots out of it. The emphasis was on holy living, holy life, and that was eclipsed in the 20th century by public religion, professional clergy, social gospel, ecumenism. We kind of became successful, and we became one of the largest movements, and issues of respectability, and we want our clergy to be more educated. All that kind of came into the mix. This is all background. So this is our history. This is where we come from. We're a connectional church. So when the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America debated the issue of should we have openly gay pastors, their system of deploying clergy is a call system. And they could say, well, if you don't want a gay pastor, don't hire one. And because they hire that, but if you know a little bit about the United Methodist Church, you have a pastor sent to you. I'm in Geneseo because the bishop for the last 9 years has appointed me to serve that church. And we have this thing called open itinerancy, which means any pastor should be able to serve in any church. And regardless of race, regardless of, if they're a United Methodist pastor in good standing, they ought to be able to serve anywhere. That's part of the stickiness of this problem. We can't just compartmentalize like some churches. And also to add to this is if the church I serve decides, well, we're just going to take our marbles and go home. We don't like what the United Methodist Church is doing. Well, our building is held in trust for the conference. If we cease to be a United Methodist Church, our properties revert to the Illinois Great Rivers Conference. We lose our building if we cease to be United Methodist. That's true of every United Methodist church. It's your property, it's our property, but when you cease to be United Methodist Church, it goes back to the denomination. So it's not just that in some denominations, there's been kind of a slow trickle of churches, well, we don't like the direction of things, so we're going to go this way. We're going to do our thing. There hasn't been that slow trickle. There's been a little bit, but not as much as other denominations because there's property issues involved. That's part of the stickiness of the problem. We're a multi-layered church. Local churches are organized into districts. Districts are organized into annual conferences. Annual conferences are part of jurisdictions, and jurisdictions are where we elect bishops. Let's put a map up, the next slide. This is a map of the annual conferences in the United Methodist Church, and the different colors are the different jurisdictions. So when we get together at jurisdictional conference, we're electing bishops. We're that blue area there, obviously, and we're electing bishops for the North Central Jurisdiction College of Bishops. The bishops are bishops of the whole church, but they're elected regionally. They are held accountable regionally. And what's happened is, let's take the West Coast. They haven't been in agreement for a long time about the United Methodist standards on human sexuality. So they've been kind of doing their own thing for a long time. And most recently, they elected a lesbian bishop to serve there. Although bishops are elected and held accountable in their jurisdiction, they're funded by the general church. They're paid for by every United Methodist salary. And so you have money issues in addition to some of these regional differences. This is all part of why this is a complicated problem, okay? I'm going to say we're an American church. Now, we're in a global church. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But we're an American church in that we're modeled in part on the U.S. Constitution. We have a legislative branch, that's General Conference. We have a judicial branch, that's our Supreme Court, our Judicial Council. And we have an executive branch, our bishops. And so you have different branches in addition to different layers. And we look a lot like America. And if you know anything about our country right now, it's very polarized. We're the church of George W. Bush is a United Methodist, Hillary Clinton's a United Methodist. And we go across the political spectrum. If you go to a Methodist church on the coast, it's very more likely to be liberal. If you go to the south, more likely to be conservative. All the nuances you see in our American political system exist within the United Methodist Church. I think we're the most American expression of Christianity you could ever imagine. And that's got the good and the bad in it, in that. Okay. We're an American church. We're also a global church. There are 12.5 million United Methodists. Since 1968 or so, we have been shrinking in the United States, but we are growing like gangbusters in Africa. And within a generation, if the present demographic trends continue, and there's every indication they will continue, we'll be a majority African church in the next 20 years. Right now, the third of the delegates at General Conference are from Africa. And Africans have a very conservative traditional view of human sexuality. They don't vote in line with American evangelical and conservative folks across the board, but when it comes on human sexuality and marriage issues, they do vote very conservatively. And so we are the last, do you know what I mean when I say mainline denomination? They used to talk about the seven sisters, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the Lutherans. What used to be the heart of American Protestantism was, and the main line has kind of moved to the sideline here in the last couple decades. But we're the last church in mainline church that's not either split over this issue or changed the stance on human sexuality. Okay, and it has to do a lot with the strength of the African influence in our church. We're not just in Africa. There's a map, I think, that follows this. Everywhere in the dark green is where the United Methodist Church is. Now, there's Methodists all over the world, but like down in Cuba, that's its own denomination, right? And so this would overlap with a lot of other Methodist denominations, but this is the United Methodist Church. And you see, in Africa, I just got back from Kenya last month and met with people from all over the continent there. The church is just growing beautifully. It's just an amazing thing how fast the church is growing. It's really something to be proud of and celebrate. If you take Europe, United Methodist, this map doesn't show density. Very few Methodists in Europe and Asia, United Methodist, Philippines. Basically, we're an African and American church. Those two, that's where 95% of the United Methodists are, okay? So let's talk a little bit about our current crisis, current situation. Crisis is a strong word, but I don't think it's too strong. I want you to know this is a serious situation. Some believe that there won't be a United Methodist Church, at least configured in the way that we are now after February of next year. I think that's probably a little bit of an overstatement, but it's not much of an overstatement. So one of the thing that is kind of the presenting issue is human sexuality. But it goes to a deeper issue of how do we read the Bible? How do we understand the Scriptures? What does the Bible have to say? So we're going to go to the next slide here. Views on human sexuality, including homosexuality, reveal the deeper divide in our church. Let's look at what the United Methodist Church says about human sexuality. Let's go to the next slide. This is right from our Book of Discipline, which is our governing document. We affirm that all persons are individuals of sacred worth, created in the image of God. All persons need the ministry of the church in their struggles for human fulfillment, as well as the spiritual and emotional care of a fellowship that enables reconciling relationships with God, with others, and with self. The United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. We affirm that God's grace is available to all. We will seek to live together in Christian community, welcoming, forgiving, and loving one another as Christ has loved and accepted us. We implore families and churches not to reject or condemn lesbian and gay members and friends. We commit ourselves to be in ministry for and with all persons. So this issue is not whether gay folks are welcome in our churches. We affirm that they are. The issue is really two issues. Let's go to the next slide. will the United Methodist Church offer marriage ceremonies to same-sex couples? And will the church ordain otherwise qualified self-avowed, this is the language of our Book of Discipline, self-avowed practicing homosexuals? Right now, our standards say that we do not do that. And it's a chargeable offense for a pastor to conduct a same-sex wedding ceremony. And that is the sticking point. It's not that everybody's welcome. It's, are we going to go the further step and celebrate same-sex weddings and recognize those as a valid expression of human sexuality for our clergy? Okay? How's everybody doing so far? Are you with me? All right. So we've been at this a while. That's the next point. We didn't just start talking about this year. We didn't start talking about it last year. We started talking about this in earnest in 1972. The United Methodist Church formed in 1968. Brand new denomination formed in Dallas, Texas, at a big uniting general conference. And they said, you know what this new denomination needs? We need a set of social principles. Where do we stand on the issues in our society? Let's get together a blue ribbon group to draft a set of social principles that we'll talk about in 4 years at the 1972 General Conference. That's exactly what happened. And there was a statement on human sexuality. And it went something that what was drafted said something like a marriage between a man and a woman should only be expressed in the covenant bond of marriage. And then it said homosexual people need the love and the grace and the ministry of the church. That's basically what came about. That's what came to the floor of General Conference. And somebody stood up and said, well, you've said that sex between a man and a woman is only within the marriage covenant. We haven't said anything about same-sex relationships. And there was an amendment offered from the floor of General Conference that took away the period, added a comma, and said, and we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this incompatible with Christian teaching. Now, that was passed by a wide margin, and it's been debated hotly every 4 years. And it's kind of been like the church, in trying to maintain that standard, it's kind of like a boat that you're trying to row across a lake and it keeps springing leaks. And so the language has had to get stronger and stronger and stronger to maintain that basic statement because it's been challenged in practice. So in 1968, we formed the church. 1972, we had our first statement that included something about homosexuality. You know, the sexual revolution had gone on through the 60s. The church really didn't need to say anything about it before then because it didn't seem to be an issue. In 1976, there were 3 statements added to our Book of Discipline that barred the use of church funds to promote homosexuality. So what was happening is a group was said, well, we said the wrong thing back then about homosexuality, so let's try to change things. And they were using church funds to do that, so we kind of plugged that hole in 1976. In 1980, there was a big report about what are the standards of ministry. It was a big new understanding of ministry. And it didn't mention homosexuality at all, and that was questioned from the floor of General Conference, saying, because there was news of a gay pastor that had been dealt with in his annual conference. We don't say anything about that. And so it was said on the floor of General Conference, well, we already say that it's incompatible with Christian teaching and our social principles. We need to trust one another. That lasted about 16 months when in Colorado there was a gay pastor that was ordained. Somebody questioned the bishop. Anytime the bishop makes a ruling, it goes to the judicial council for them to review that. And the judicial council said, well, there's nothing in the Book of Discipline against it, so there's nothing wrong. So at the next General Conference, there were 1,000 petitions that came to General Conference, 30 of them from annual conferences, saying we have to put something in the Book of Discipline that says if you're living in a relationship with someone of the same sex, you should not be a pastor. So that was added in 1984. In 1988, we affirmed that God's grace is available to all. We commit ourselves to be in ministry with all persons. In 1992, we affirmed the church's teaching. In 1996, we added that we added a definition of self-avowed practicing homosexuals. There was a pastor brought up on trial, and and someone argued, well, her legal team argued, well, the Constitution of our church says we shouldn't discriminate on anybody based on their status. Being gay is a status. Being a self-avowed practicing homosexual. And the Judicial Council said, well, we don't have a definition of what that even means. So they provided this definition, which is a very narrow definition. Gabe gave me some water, but I'm going to avail myself of that. Which says a self-avowed practicing homosexual is someone that tells their bishop or their district superintendent that they're in a sexual relationship with someone of the same gender. That's a pretty narrow definition. That doesn't happen very often. Somebody talks to their bishop or their district superintendent about their sexual habits. So it was a narrow definition trying to avoid a disruption with the word status in our Constitution. In 2000, we added language that says we shouldn't reject, families shouldn't reject their gay and lesbian members and friends. We affirmed our position in 2004, hotly debated. In 2008, we added a statement against homophobia and heterosexism. In 2012, we voted down two statements that, two items stating that Christians have different opinions about this. I think it was Eddie Fox that stood up and said, we disagree on all of this stuff. We start saying what what we disagree on, we'd have to say we disagree on all of this. And in 2016, of course, a lot had changed by that time. Same-sex marriage was the law of the land by that General Conference in America. And it was clear by the first week of General Conference, you work in committees, and then it all comes to the floor the second week. And it was clear the General Conference was moving in the traditional direction again. And there was talk about the church breaking up at that point. And so the idea was raised on the floor, let's ask the bishops to organize a commission to study this and bring back a report. And that was the commission on the way forward. We took 100 legislative items having to do with human sexuality, and we tabled them. One of my favorite quotes from General Conference, I overheard somebody say, hundreds of people getting together to talk about sex for 2 weeks ought to be more fun than this. It was a very tense General Conference. And so our bishops were invited we tabled everything, we invited the bishops to intervene. And so they brought together a commission on a way forward with this mission statement. Are you keeping up with me here? I haven't been looking over my shoulder. To bring together persons deeply committed to the future or futures of the United Methodist Church with an openness to developing new relationships with each other, exploring possible future or futures of our denomination in light of the General Conference and subsequent actions. So they chose 32 members. 8 were bishops, 11 were laity, 11 were ordained elders, 2 were deacons, 3 were homosexual. Leaders of our renewal groups, you may know of Good News and some of the groups that have done a long time trying to take the church in a more evangelical direction. They had a professional facilitator. 3 bishops served as moderator, and they began meeting in 2016. But a lot of other things started to happen as well. So in 2016, 12 annual conferences said they would not obey the Book of Discipline when it comes to this issue. They, on the whole Western jurisdiction basically, and several churches on the East Coast, closer to home, the Northern Illinois Conference. Some of these were through their Board of Ordained Ministry, and some of these were by plenary action saying we are going to defy the Book of Discipline. We're not going to do it that way. The Wesley Covenant Association formed, which was basically a coalition of more traditionalist-leaning United Methodists saying that we oppose what was then being called the local option, which is every church just kind of do what you want to do, taking a stand against that. And then Karen Olivito was elected as a bishop in our church, and she's been married to her wife Robin for several years, and she was a pastor of Glide Memorial United Methodist Church. And she's still in office today, although the Judicial Council has ruled that she should be removed by due process. This is a kind of a map of the conferences that have say we're not going to obey the Book of Discipline. And so if an area is white or very light gray, these are either their Board of Ordained Ministry or the plenary body said we are not going to obey the Book of Discipline on this issue. Now, just looking at maps a little deceiving. If you take the North Georgia Conference, can you find North Georgia on that map? There are more United Methodists in the North Georgia Conference than that whole western area of the United States. Okay? So it looks like, well, it's half the country, but there's only 300,000 United Methodists in that whole western side of the church. And in the more progressive areas, our church is dying the quickest. Our strength is really in the southeast and in Texas and the south central area. That's the only really area we're holding our own numerically. So there's some regional differences in our church as well. So just to give you a little timeline, development since 2016, the Council of Bishops formed the commission in July. The commission has met 9 times since. And when I say they've met for several days at a time. Okay? They weren't trying to come of one mind on the issue of homosexuality. They were trying to decide what are we going to do about this, given the fact that we disagree. The bishops called a special session of General Conference for February 2019. And regular updates were given to the bishops. They developed 3 models, 3 sketches. They said basically there's 3 ways we can go at this. One is a traditionalist model that keeps our standards and enforces them better. The second is a multi-branch plan that divides the denomination into sub-denominations based on human sexuality, and a contextual plan they later called the One Church plan, that would change our stance but allow for disagreement. It was decided by the bishops that all but the traditional sketch would be further developed. And the bishops asked his judicial council for a declaratory decision about who could submit legislation. There was a preliminary report that was brought to the Council of Bishops in late April, early May 2018. The bishops endorsed the One Church plan, which is to change our stance on human sexuality by a majority, not a supermajority. But they also voted to submit all 3 plans in legislative form for General Conference to consider. And so there was kind of a scramble because the traditional plan only existed in a little half-page outline form. And there was a kind of a rush to put that into legislative form so that it could be considered. The commission and a group of bishops scrambled to complete the traditional plan. May 25th, 2018, the Judicial Council ruled that outside petitions could be submitted, so there's other plans that are going to come besides these 3 plans. And bishops, just so you know, have no vote at General Conference. They preside over General Conference, but they do not vote at General Conference. The commission's report was to be translated into 4 languages because we're a global church, and they've asked for declaratory decisions by the Judicial Council on all 3 plans, whether these plans are constitutional or not. So that's going to happen next month in Zurich. Our Supreme Court, our Judicial Council is going to meet and see if there's any problems with any of the plans in keeping, because we have a Constitution. And we can change our Constitution, but it's a hairy process. It's 2/3 majority and ratification around the world, which doesn't happen very often. Okay? So that's what brings us to this point. We're going to go back. We're going to dig into the 3 plans. But any questions about how we got here at this point? Any discussion about the process? Yeah, Gary, can you pass the microphone around? Are you having fun so far? Here's a question right here, Gary.
Is the book of discipline derivative from the Bible?
That's a great question. The relationship between the book of discipline and the Bible. Well, there's several sections in the book of discipline. One is our doctrinal standards. Our doctrinal standards are the Articles of Religion of the Methodist Church, the Confession of Faith. That's what I was trying to think of a while ago. The Evangelical United Brethren Church. The Standard Sermons of John Wesley and his notes on the New Testament. And not all the sermons aren't printed in the Book of Discipline, but there is protective language in our Constitution that says you can't change our doctrine except by, I think it's 3/4 majority. You can't. It's almost an impossible standard to make a change to anything that's a doctrinal standard. So then you have statements that are like our theological task, which is the so-called Wesleyan quadrilateral, which is how we do theology in the United Methodist Church. And it talks about this is how we use Scripture, that we draw from tradition, we draw from our own experience, and we draw from reason to develop theology. So you have kind of a section of the discipline that says, here's how we read the Bible. And then you have the Constitution, which is a structural thing mainly. You know, this is how we're structured. And then you have the rest of the Book of Discipline, which includes social principles on, you know, where does United Methodist stand on abortion? Where do we stand on nuclear war? Agrarian societies? Everything you could imagine is under there. We have a statement on just about everything, including homosexuality. And then we have how the church is structured. So some of it is the rules of annual conferences, but what we believe about the Bible is in mainly our doctrinal standards. But there's a lot. It's about that thick, and the old Book of Discipline used to be like that, and it's like that now. It's quite a thick book, and I'm sure you can find versions of it online if you like to peruse in there and see. But basically it says, it's our connectional covenant. This is how the United Methodist Church is going to operate, basically. That's what the Book of Discipline is. Did I answer your question? Okay. Well, yes, sir.
I collect old disciplines. Part of the reason they were smaller in the old days was they used really minuscule.
They did, and you know, preachers had to carry them on horseback too, so that kept them thin too. You didn't want to have real thick, but you know, we legislate a lot of things now that used to be kind of common sense. In Africa, they can have their own book of discipline, but it's underneath the current book of discipline, and they operate in Africa. I got a hold of an African discipline when I was over there in Kenya, and it's. The newest update is 1992, and they operate there not so much on what it says in a book somewhere, but what does it say in the Bible, and what do our leaders preach, and it's more about relationships there than about rules. We've gotten very much about rules in our church. All right, well, let's dig into the plans a little bit here to stay on good time. The first plan, this is the plan, by the way, that has been endorsed by a majority of our bishops, and it's called the One Church Plan. There's a little bit of marketing in the name there, which is, I think, kind of unfortunate. I wish we just kind of kept it all without marketing language, but the One Church Plan. And here are some of the details of that plan. It would add language to our Book of Discipline to say we are not of one mind regarding human sexuality, and that people of good Christian conscience interpret and decide these issues differently. So it's going to say we don't agree, and there's good Christians on both sides. It affirms that those who continue to maintain the scriptural witness do not condone the practice of. It affirms those people who continue to maintain that the scriptural witness does not condone the practice of homosexuality. It also affirms those who believe the witness of Scripture calls us to reconsider the teaching of the church with respect to monogamous homosexual relationships. It affirms the sanctity of marriage, and it says traditionally understood as the union of one man and one woman. So where we say now that marriage is the union between one man and one woman, it says marriage has traditionally been understood that way. It eliminates our support for laws in civil society that define marriage only as the union between one man and one woman. Right now our Book of Discipline says we support laws in civil society that say that marriage is just between a man and a woman. It states that no clergy should be forced to conduct a ceremony for same-sex couples. Right now, pretty much a pastor in the United Methodist Church decides who they're going to marry and who they're not going to marry. And they're saying that no pastor should be forced to do a same-sex marriage if that's against their conscience. It eliminates the phrase that the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. So that's probably the most contentious statement in our Book of Discipline. That's what we fight about the most. It eliminates that statement. It removes the prohibition against practicing homosexuals from being pastors and candidates for ministry. Right now that's prohibited. But you need to know that 213 pastors came out of the closet before General Conference 2016, and they call themselves the Queer Clergy Caucus. That's the name they give themselves. So it's been like not in the Western jurisdiction. They stopped asking the questions long ago. Okay, so it was not hard to find someone to elect for bishop that's gay. There's a lot of gay clergy in our system because it's been kind of a don't ask, don't tell kind of reality. If your bishop doesn't support what the Book of Discipline says, it just kind of gets ignored. It states that clergy shall not be compelled or prohibited from officiating a same-sex wedding. So under the one church plan, every pastor in the United States, wherever it's legal by civil society, any pastor can conduct a same-sex wedding. It can't be held in the church unless the church votes to allow it. So if a pastor wanted to do a same-sex wedding for a couple and their church had not voted to allow that, they would go to a park, they would go to a wedding venue. The local church would have to vote to have same-sex weddings in their sanctuary. It states, bishops must have another bishop ordain anyone they cannot in good conscience ordain. So if you have a bishop you have a candidate for ministry and their conference allows gay clergy and the bishop doesn't feel like that's in keeping with Scripture, they have to find another bishop to lay hands on that clergy and ordain them. The Board of Ordained Ministry of an annual conference votes on whether to ordain self-avowed practicing homosexuals and brings its recommendation to the clergy session. So how the decision will be made at the annual conference is the Board of Ordained Ministry that's appointed by the bishop will make that decision as a recommendation to the clergy session. One of the criticisms of the one church plan is laity don't get much say in whether we have gay pastors or not. It's really the pastors that are deciding. The clergy session at annual conference makes a decision. The bishop may ask for an advisory vote from the full annual conference, which is half clergy, half laity. After voting, the conference must wait a full 30 calendar months before taking the issue up again. We don't want to debate this every year at our annual conferences. So once an annual conference votes, you have to wait 30 months, basically 3 years, before you bring it back up again, unless the bishop says you can talk about it. And that's a questionable provision by our Constitution, but that's in the plan. It removes chargeable offenses for being a self-avowed practicing homosexual. Right now, a pastor can be brought up on charges for doing a same-sex wedding. We got a list in the Book of Discipline of what a pastor can be charges can be brought against a pastor for. And that's one of them, being self-avowed practicing homosexual or doing a gay wedding. Removes chargeable offenses for same-sex weddings. Any clergy may officiate a same-sex wedding wherever law allows. Central conferences in Africa, they are given time to change their Book of Disciplines to restrict same-sex marriage. So the proponent of the one church plan would say, well, this doesn't affect Africa. Africa can create their own rules, and we'll just do this regionally. Okay? There is no exit provision, no new exit provision in this plan. The other two plans kind of give a way for people that disagree to create their own thing. And there is no exit provision under the one church plan, other than the current exit provision, which is you negotiate it with your annual conference. If a local church is released from the trust clause, that's that thing that's on our deed in our local church property, that says our property is tied to the annual conference, that church must pay a minimum portion of the unfunded pension liability of that annual conference. As an annual conference, we've made pension promises to our clergy. And those promises, I think all of us agree, should be kept. And so if a church is those pension promises have been made based on the number of churches we have. And so if we're going to have some large churches exit, they own a share of that liability. Our conference is pretty well funded on pensions. That's not a big issue. But there would be a fee that churches would pay to leave the denomination. So I'm going to get to the strengths and weaknesses of this plan. The strengths of the One Church plan is it provides freedom for churches, clergy, and conferences who want to affirm same-sex marriage. There's no structural change. Those that are saying we must do this, it gives space for them to do this. A proponent of the One Church plan would say that local churches don't have to vote if they don't want to. You don't have to take a vote on whether you're going to have a same-sex wedding or not if it's not a non-issue for your church. You don't have to have a local church vote. Language is included that's aimed at protecting the consciences of clergy and bishops that believe that same-sex marriage is contrary to Scripture. The weaknesses of the One Church plan, and by the way, these strengths and weaknesses, this is the gospel according to Chris Ritter here on this. You know, somebody else might come up with a different list. Okay, I'm just trying to do it as fairly and objectively as I can. I'm not objective, by the way. I mean, I'm not neutral in all this discussion. I'm very involved in all this. Traditional conferences, these are the weaknesses. Traditional conferences will nevertheless have openly gay clergy serving and subject to guaranteed appointment. So just because you restrict people who are being ordained doesn't say anything about the current clergy we already have serving. And there's no way to exit them. And even a conference that says we don't want to allow the ordination of gay clergy, if they're already there, there's nothing you can do about that. If someone's already ordained and they come out of the closet or whatever, there's nothing to prevent that. Bishops are required to appoint clergy to churches whether they agree with their lifestyle or not. So there is a violation of conscience for traditional bishops. Churches may be pressured to hold divisive votes. A church may say, well, we're not going to vote on this issue, but then if somebody wants to raise a stink over it, the decision has to be made by the local church. I think everybody wants to avoid the local church vote. My church is divided on this issue. I assume your church is divided on this issue. Okay? So it's a painful thing for a local congregation to have to decide what weddings are we going to do and not do. And when most churches are going to deal with it is probably when it comes up. And by that time, it's somebody's nephew. And it comes about who gives money and who's the chair of the church council, and all those issues that get folded in. I really hope that we can get a decision above the local church level. Let's see. The conflict at General Conference will potentially be pushed down to the congregational and conference level. So basically, we're having a big fight every 4 years at General Conference. My concern is, are we just pushing that down to where ministry happens at the annual conference level and the congregational level? Funding for bishops is left fuzzy. The plan says our General Council on Finance and Administration should find a way to fund bishops where every annual conference funds its own bishop. But they don't tell us how that would be, and really it's not in keeping with our Constitution. So you'll still be paying for bishops that don't fit your vision of what a bishop should be potentially. Military chaplains are put in a difficult situation. Right now, the military says if you don't have to do a same-sex wedding if you're a chaplain. If your sponsoring body, your church, prohibits it. And it's really a gray area whether that, under the One Church plan, if our chaplains would have to do same-sex weddings if they didn't feel that they could do that with their understanding of Scripture. That's the One Church plan. We're going to go to the next one. Any comments or questions before we move on? Right over here. This does not require constitutional amendments. So this could be done by simple vote, majority vote at General
Could you put that
Conference.
previous slide back? Just the very first one. Does that mean the traditional conferences will nevertheless have openly gay clergy because we have them now? Does that mean that if we don't want to ordain them and then they turn gay after or announce gaydom or whatever after they are ordained, they still can stay?
Yeah. There's a provision that says annual conferences can vote whether they want to ordain self-avowed practicing homosexuals. The clergy session votes on that. But that doesn't say anything about the ones that are already serving, or if you're already ordained and then you go public or whatever. Yeah, that's true. All right, there are two other plans, and one is the Connectional Conference Plan. Actually, most of the time of the Commission on a Way Forward was spent writing the Connectional Conference Plan. And Gary mentioned I've done a lot of legislative work. I did a lot of work before General Conference 2016 on something called the jurisdictional solution. Is there a way to reinvent the jurisdictional layer of our church to give space, kind of keep us all under the same tent but compartmentalized? And I kind of gave up on that project after General Conference 2016, but the work got into the Commission on a Way Forward, and they produced a plan that's very thorough. It does require constitutional amendments, which means it had to be passed by 2/3, and then 2/3, the aggregate vote of every annual conference by 2/3 would have to approve it for our Constitution as a church to be changed, which is just one section in our Book of Discipline. And some people believe that it's more likely to see a herd of pigs fly over this church right now than for anything having to do with human sexuality to be passed by 2/3 majority and ratified, given the environment that we're in our church. And I think that's a fair criticism. The 5 jurisdictions, I showed you a map of our jurisdictions in the United States, would be replaced by 3 connectional conferences. Think many denominations. And so there'd be 3 maps of annual conferences that would all overlap with one another. The connectional conferences would each have a different position relative to human sexuality. One would be a progressive. These labels all break down at some point, but progressive would affirm homosexuality and say you can't discriminate against gay people in any way. There would be a traditional one which would hold our current view, and there'd be a unity, they call it a unity connectional conference, that would say it's not a big deal, each church can do what they want to do, kind of the local option or the one church plan in the middle section there. Each connectional conference would be the primary denominational identity for their churches. So the name on your sign out front would be your connectional conference and not the United Methodist Church, probably. Each jurisdiction would vote which connectional conference to join. So using our example, the North Central Jurisdictional Conference would say, which one do we want to be in? They would choose one. And if our annual conference, our Illinois Great Rivers annual conference, was okay with that, we would just not have to do anything. We wouldn't even have to vote. But if we didn't like the choice that they made, we could vote to join a different one. And local churches, if you like what your annual conference did, you wouldn't have to do anything. You just naturally go along with your annual conference. But if you didn't like what your annual conference did, you could say, wait a minute, we want to be in a different connectional conference. And you would opt out of that conference and you would opt into the one that you feel like best matches your church. So it would be a minority of churches and conferences that would have to vote, but there would be some voting that would take place.
Chris?
Yes?
And these would not be geographical.
They would each cover the United States. You would still be in an annual conference. Annual conferences would be geographically larger. So let's say it's no secret that the Northern Illinois Conference is quite a bit more, use the word liberal, use the word progressive, than the Illinois Great Rivers Conference, with Chicago in the mix there. And they're one of those that said we're not going to obey the Book of Discipline, or they've tried to do that. So kind of what would happen is, let's say they went with the more progressive one, and and Illinois Great Rivers went, let's say, with a more traditional one, we would pick up some churches from the Northern Illinois Conference that say, we want to go with you guys. And there'd be some churches in our conference that would say, well, we're going to join those guys. And so the conference maps would overlap. We might cover all of Illinois now, or maybe we cover all of Illinois and part of Indiana. Conference maps would change to be larger because you got a bigger area that you got to spread over. So we're taking 56 annual conferences and we're spreading them out 3 times all across the United States. Okay, so they're going to get quite a bit larger. So you might be in part of more of a Midwestern. And if you're a conservative living on the West Coast, you're going to be in a great big annual conference that covers the whole western part of the United States. If you're a conservative in the Southeast, it's going to look more like it does now. But if you're a progressive that wants to do same-sex weddings in the Southeast, you're going to be part of a big annual conference that covers all of the Southeast. So the maps are going to look different. And you might have 2 Methodist churches in the same town that do it differently, that are part of different annual conferences, that one does same-sex weddings, one will not do same-sex weddings. Okay? Let's see here. Each connectional conference would fund its own bishops. That's how we solve we're not going to pay for bishops that we don't agree with. General conference would still happen, but it would be shorter. There'd still be a council. I'm going backwards here on this slide. I apologize. Let's go to the one that starts with UMC Council of Bishops. They'd be a conversation group. They wouldn't have any real authority. They kind of are that now, but they would just kind of get together. But the real decisions would be made at the College of Bishops, the smaller bodies. General conference would be shorter. The book of discipline would be shorter because we're putting all the decisive stuff down in these other groups. Each connectional conference would fund its own bishop. Next slide. Each connectional conference would have its own book of discipline, and it would be underneath a general book of discipline that would belong to the United Methodist Church. Central conferences would become a connectional conference or join one of the 3. So central conferences are bodies outside the United States. They could join these connectional conferences or be their own. Each connectional conference would have its own judicial council, Supreme Court. Each connectional conference would be its own 501c3. Next slide. Each of the 3 connectional conferences would cover the entire United States. And this takes a long time to implement because you got to pass it by 2/3 majority. Then we got to wait a couple years and see if it gets ratified all around the world. And they try to expedite that. Then you got to implement it, which is a lot of sorting out of our denominational bureaucracy. So I'm going to give you my opinion of the strengths and weaknesses of the connectional conference plan. The strengths is fair and equitable. Everybody's got a place to land. It's very comprehensive. They've thought about what about our seminaries? What about our institutions? What about our schools? What about? They sat down and handled all the whatabouts. Okay, it's all in there. The plan's highly refined, covers all the bases. It creates multiple expressions of United Methodism. The weaknesses is it requires constitutional amendments. It requires an extended timeline. It divides the church based on human sexuality. It's kind of a strange thing to choose your denomination on. It's just on human sexuality, and it does that. And it would likely result in 2 groups, not 3. The reason I say that is, let's say that you're the most progressive group, and you have a choice of isolating yourself into a little compartment or being part of the do what you want to group. You can still do everything you want to in the middle group and still advance your cause. So I don't think the most progressive branch would ever even populate. I don't think anybody would join it. So really you're dividing the church into 2, basically, I think, in practical reality. That's the connectional conference plan. Anybody got a question about the plan or the shape of the plan? There are questions.
It sounds as if the church would be adding 3 or maybe just 2 layers of bureaucracy, recreating what we have now, doubling it.
So there's no, and I wasn't really clear on that. There are no new layers, but we're replacing the jurisdictional layer with these connectional conferences. So there wouldn't be that Midwestern group that we're part of anymore. That Midwestern group of conferences would have to choose one of the 3 new connectional conferences. We're eliminating our jurisdictions in the United States, and we're saying that there's now, basically we had 5 jurisdictions, now we're going to have 3, and instead of being based on geography, they're going to be based on human sexuality. So we still have, some would say we already have too many layers, and it doesn't eliminate any layers, but it doesn't add any layers either. Yeah. And we had, one back there, Gary.
I'm a firm believer in cheating off of other people's papers. Mm-hmm. Have other denominations gone through this, where they've done this kind of stratified division, and do they remain connected? I mean, I came out of the Lutheran Church, where there was a Missouri Synod and evangelicals. We were different denominations. Yeah. I mean, do we have a hope of still being United Methodist when we get on the other side of this?
There are some that would view the Connectional Conference plan as just the prelude to the inevitable split. This is a stopping over point on, once these groups get assembled, they'll look at one another and say, we really don't have much in common with those folks over there. Let's just, you do your thing, we'll do ours, or we're all nice. Methodist Church, niceness is part of our creed, so we might, out of niceness, say we're going to continue to be together. There are, every mainline denomination has dealt with this. In the Episcopal Church, they changed their standards. And in the town I live in, we don't have an Episcopal church anymore. We have an Anglican church, right? So the conservatives, first of all, they went and found African bishops to be under. And so you had a lot leave. And the Episcopal Church spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on lawsuits because they have this trust clause thing too. And the denomination took a hard stand. They said, you're not going to leave. And if you do leave, you don't even get to buy your building. We're not going to sell it to you at any price because we're going to draw a hard line against those that want to leave. So it was, to leave the denomination was to leave your building with no chance of even buying it at full market value. And it got really, really ugly, and they spent a lot of money on lawyers. The Lutheran Church are a little more loosely connected, and so it's just been more of a migration. There's been less of a disruption because they're less connected than we are. But they still have lost churches. The Presbyterians right now, there's a new denomination that's still in the process. Presbyterians do everything slow. They study it and to death, and they're very thorough. And so you have the evangelical EOC, Evangelical Order, Covenant Order of Presbyterians, which is the more traditional group. And churches are doing a study process to see if they want to leave the United Presbyterian Church to join that. So there have been some numbers lost. There's not been a success story. There's not another denomination that's wired up quite like we are, and there's not been a success story. There's not been any group that said, yeah, we did this, it was great. It's all been bad, unfortunately.
I think I read somewhere that in the Episcopal Church, the cost was over $40 million in the issue of fighting this. The lawyers love it, but I'm not sure that's good use. That's not what we put money in the offering plate to do, is fight with other Christians about property issues. Yeah. Okay, so that's 2 plans. Let's get to the third plan, which is a traditional plan. This is the plan that kind of, back in November, the bishop says we don't even want to see a version of this, but basically what happened, anecdotally, when the Council of Bishops got together, the African bishop says, we can't take the Connectional Conference plan back to Africa. We can't take the One Church plan back to Africa. If you don't give us a traditional plan, we're going home, basically. And so what they wanted was something near a unanimous agreement by the bishops. And so how they did that is they said, okay, our majority support the One Church plan, but we think that all 3 plans should be considered. And so that was kind of the bargain that was struck. And so there was a scramble to get, there was already drafts of this out there. Groups have been working on this. So it wasn't like totally starting from scratch, but there was a lot of work that had to be done in a short amount of time. The traditional plan retains our current language on human sexuality, enhances enforcement, and provides a gracious exit for those that cannot live by these standards.
Okay, that's kind of the three pillars of the traditional plan. So first of all, our boat is leaking, right? There's the Book of Discipline's being ignored, so there's a lot of enforcement stuff in the plan. So here's the enforcement stuff. We widen the definition of self-avowed practicing homosexuals to match what the Judicial Council recently said. When Karen Olivito was brought up, her case as bishop was brought up before the Judicial Council, it was argued that, well, she's not a self-avowed practicing homosexual even though she's married to a woman because she hasn't called herself that. You're only that if you call yourself a self-avowed practicing homosexual. And Judicial Council said, well, if you're married to somebody of the same sex, you're probably a self-avowed practicing homosexual. So the unfortunate part of that is the marriage license becomes the smoking gun at that point, but which is hurtful to a lot of people. But it widens the definition to say if you're in a same-sex marriage, yes, you fit this definition. It mandates that a just resolution include a promise by all parties to live by the Book of Discipline. We have this process called a just resolution. So if I'm brought up on charges as a pastor, those charges are filed with my bishop, and the bishop takes those charges, meets with me, and if we can work it out, me and the bishop, maybe that's a promise by me not to do it again. Maybe it's an apology by me. Maybe it's we both agree that was a dumb accusation anyway. But basically the clergy and the bishop agree that it's settled, and it's called a just resolution. No further process happens. Well, the problem with that, some would say, is the person that made the complaint doesn't have any say in that. The person that made the complaint doesn't get to say, well, that's settled. So the bishop basically is to use that power they can sweep anything under the rug that they want to. If they want to get rid of a complaint, they have a quick and easy way to do it. So we changed the just resolution process by saying that all parties, that you have to promise to obey the Book of Discipline in the future if you want to get a just resolution agreement. It requires annual conferences to affirm that they will comply with the Book of Discipline. If an annual conference wants to stay United Methodist, they have to agree to live by the Book of Discipline as our covenant. Those annual conferences that cannot certify adherence to the Book of Discipline will be encouraged to form what we call an affiliated autonomous body or affiliated autonomous church. Basically, they become their own denomination. Until they do so, they can't use the United Methodist Cross and Flame logo. There's very few things that are governed by the general church, and one of them is use of the logo. So basically, the accountability is you can't use our logo if you're not going to follow our rules. They'll also not be able to participate in the denomination financially. So there's kind of an embargo against these conferences. They can't send money to the United Methodist Church. They can't receive money from the United Methodist Church until they become their own denomination. The Council of Bishops may place one of its own members on involuntary leave of absence. Right now, the Council of Bishops doesn't hold its own members accountable. They're held accountable in their College of Bishops, in their jurisdiction. We changed that already in 2016. We passed a constitutional amendment that said that bishops can hold each other accountable at the Council of Bishops. They can place one of their own members on leave of absence. And that was an issue. There was an issue with a bishop in Africa that $400,000 went missing. And nothing was done about it. And so there's been an acknowledgement beyond the human sexuality issue that bishops should be able to police their own. And we actually put measures in the Book of Discipline already. They're already there that say it's brand new, but that bishops can hold one another accountable. So they can. There's a conference. There's a council relations committee that does due process, and they can put a bishop on involuntary leave of absence. Members of the Board of Ordained Ministry must certify they'll enforce the Book of Discipline. So before someone can join the Board of Ordained Ministry, that's the group that interviews pastors, whether they're going to be ordained or not. They have to be willing to uphold the discipline. There's limitation on what cases a bishop can dismiss against a clergy. The complainant, that's the person making a complaint against the pastor, is included in the just resolution process. the church can have the right of appeal if there's been egregious errors of church law. What you have happening right now is a pastor may come to trial, but his jury are other pastors, and they say, we don't agree with the Book of Discipline either, so we're not going to do anything about this. And basically, it's, if you're familiar with legal terms, it's jury nullification. The jury is not doing their job. The church can appeal that. Bishops staying in the UMC are expressly forbidden from consecrating and ordaining self-avowed practicing homosexuals. And there's a gracious exit. Every annual conference will vote on whether they can support the Book of Discipline or not. Those that cannot so certify are placed on a list, and they're given time to take the new status. So they let their jurisdictional conference know that they're going to be leaving, and the jurisdictional conference will meet and remap their annual conference. So let's say Northern Illinois Conference says, okay, the traditional plan's passed, we're out of here. Individual churches get a chance to stay in the United Methodist Church. So you can't just have a hole in the map. You've got to have an annual conference covering that area. So the jurisdictional conference, which is the group that maps the annual conferences, would get together and say, okay, these churches in Northern Illinois that want to stay United Methodist, we're going to put them in with the Illinois Great Rivers Conference. So our conference now would maybe cover the whole United States. It's just an example of how that might work. You've got to plug the holes in the map. Individual churches and clergy in the conferences can vote to remain United Methodist. So if you're a more traditional church or a more traditional clergy in a progressive conference that's leaving the United Methodist Church, you have a chance to stay. Bishops also are asked to certify that they're willing to uphold the Book of Discipline, and if they're not willing, they get referred to the new Council of Bishops Council Relation Committee for suspension. Any annual conference can form a self-governing church for any reason. So let's say the annual conference says, we're okay, we don't have an issue with the human sexuality stuff, but we just don't want to be United Methodist anymore. We want to do our own thing. You can become your own denomination. Any 50 congregations can form a self-governing church. So basically the foundation of this is nobody should be kept against their will in the denomination. So if 50 local churches want to go together and start their own autonomous denomination, they can do that under this plan. Self-governing church can develop a version of the cross and flame for their use if approved by GCFA. So let's say we have now the Progressive Methodist Church. They can have a version of the cross and flame. It's different than the United Methodist Cross and Flame, but it recognizes the shared history. United Methodist institutions can develop missional ties with new denominations formed through the plan. Churches and clergy in United Methodist conferences can transfer or join conferences that are exiting, retaining property, and pensions. So let's say the Northern Illinois Conference is leaving, and we've got some churches in our conference say, hey, we want to go with you. They can do that. They can join them. So strengths and weaknesses of the traditional plan. It's decisive. It says definitely this is the direction we're going. It allows a gracious exit for those that do not want to be United Methodist or follow United Methodist rules. The weakness is, like the other two plans, it will result in more than one denomination. And there's a question on whether the provisions will be followed by the people that aren't following the Book of Discipline right now. Will they follow through on the things that are being dictated to them? So, any questions about the traditional plan?
Thanks. I wasn't quite clear. So, is the gracious exit going to allow individual churches, denominations, whatever, or people who want to form a sub-denomination, are they going to be allowed to take their property with them? Do they buy it? Is it retained by the traditional United Methodist Church?
That's a great question. So basically, they take their property with them free and clear. The only provision, basically Westpath is our board of pensions, and there's billions of dollars in Westpath. It's a big deal. All the pensions for all the United Methodist clergy. It's headquartered there in Glenview and around Chicago. I was just at their headquarters. They do a phenomenal job, and everybody's wondering what's going to happen to the pensions. basically they've looked at all three of these plans, and they have proposed legislation to go with all three of them. If this happens, this is what you should do financially. And there is a like if a church leaves their annual conference through this plan, they do have a buyout if there's unfunded pension liability. If Westpath does a calculation and says, okay, there's this much unfunded, let's say there's $1 million of unfunded pension liability in this conference, and this church is 0.02% of that unfunded liability, so you have to pay that. You have to pay a certain amount on your way out, so that the pension promises can be paid. But all three of plans cover pensions. Westpath has taken care of all that. They've been very proactive. When I was writing legislation and stuff, they had me come over and look at it all. They've got lawyers. They've been really proactive in looking at all this. So all three plans help us keep our pension promises, and all three plans have a way to deal with the property issue, except the one church plan. There's some open questions on churches that would want to leave and what happens to their property. Any other questions about the traditional plan? There's one right there.
I'm kind of wondering, on the traditional plan is more like what we are here in this church. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Where I'm going with this is evangelical churches. We're mainline with some other churches. What about how big is the evangelical churches that aren't mainline? I'm just kind of curious.
You mean within the United Methodist Church, you mean?
Well, currently? No, that's outside the Methodist Church. We talked about Lutherans a little bit and Episcopals and Presbyterians. What about the ones that are outside that are just independent?
Independent churches, yeah.
Yeah, non-denominational.
Yeah.
I guess that's the term,
Yeah, I've got an opinion about that. I don't like the individual exit for churches that just give us our property and leave, because that you become congregational at that point. My friend Bob Phillips calls them self-licking lollipops. That they just do their own thing, and connectionalism is part of our DNA, and so you can only leave under the traditional plan if you're part of another group of churches that are leaving. You don't leave there's no individual exit. In the one church plan, if you leave, if you can negotiate your exit, you're leaving as an individual church, and you're your own. You got to find. Now there are other denominations in the Wesleyan tradition. There's the Wesleyan Church. There's the Free Methodists. There's Nazarenes. There's any number of first cousins out there that another church could join, but. Connectionalism is part of our DNA. And what happens if we've seen churches that leave, within a generation or two, they become more like Baptists instead of Methodists in their theology. They kind of lose their Wesleyan flavor when they go independent and just do their own thing. And I'm concerned about that. I don't like the individual exit for that reason. There's a lot of mega churches. If you're a mega church in the United Methodist Church, you're your own denomination. You don't need a pension plan. You got your own pension plan. You got your own lawyers. You got your own. You got everything you need. You don't need a denomination. And so a lot of these churches say, "Give us our property, and we're out of here." I don't think that's good for the church as a whole necessarily. Just because we're mainly a small membership church denomination. We have a lot of little churches, and little churches don't have the options that big churches have. They don't have theologians on staff, and they don't have staff that can, deal with HR issues and all that. I think churches need to stick together. And the Wesley Covenant Association, full disclosure, of which I'm a part, we're doing a lot of what-if scenarios right now. And it's more the group that if evangelicals get edged out by where the denomination goes, is there a place we can land together? What will we look like after the United Methodist Church does something like the one church plan? So there's a lot of what-if scenarios. But you ask, how does the denomination break out? This is really where we're going next. How are we doing on time here? Okay. We're almost to the hour point. Yeah, if you take a general conference and you say, General Conference, vote on human sexuality, as it's currently configured, and by the way, the same people that came together in 2016 are going to come together in 2019. Very few annual conferences elected new delegations. So it's basically the same people coming together again. It's about 55% on the traditional side and about 45% that would change our standards on human sexuality. Of that 55%, about 30% is the influence from Africa, and about 25% are U.S. churches. So if the U.S. church was making this decision by itself, we would have done something like the one church plan a long time ago. Okay, so that's kind of how it all breaks out. But U.S. more evangelical-leaning churches and Africa together form a majority. And so what you have is a polarized church. It's not, we say, well, we're divided, but really you got two centers of gravity. So I've got a little slide here. This is a famous illustration that was put together by Tom Berlin out in Virginia, the pastor of Flourish United Methodist Church, member of the Commission on a Way Forward. And he calls it the sugar packet illustration. And why sugar packets? I don't know why it became sugar packets, but it's just 4 categories. And he's thinking mainly in the United States here about human sexuality. On the left are progressive non-compatibilists. And they say, a progressive non-compatibilist would say that we should not discriminate against anybody based on human sexuality. We should do same-sex weddings. And as a church, I don't want to be in a church with anybody that doesn't think that way. Okay? That would be a progressive non-compatibilist. So they think this is the right way, and there really shouldn't be any difference of opinion in that. Then you have progressive compatibilists that say, yeah, I want to do a same-sex wedding in my church, but I still want to be in connection with those that are more traditional. And good Christians are on both sides. Then there's traditional compatibilists, which are people saying, I personally wouldn't do a same-sex wedding, but I'm okay being in a denomination where other people are doing that. It doesn't affect me and my ministry. I'll do things how I want to do it. I actually think that's a very small category in our church. And then there's traditional non-compatibilists, which say, this is what the Bible teaches, and Christians should be faithful to that, and I really don't care to be in a church with a difference of opinion about that. We need to be agreed with that. So these categories have been used for discussion purposes over the last few years. And let's go to the next slide. And you could kind of do a bell curve based on where the church stands. So there's a lot of figures like Adam Hamilton, the pastor of our largest United Methodist Church. He says he's changed his mind on the issue of homosexuality. And he said, most Methodists are in the middle somewhere. We're a denomination of middlers. And so we need to carve a denomination out of the middle somehow and then let the people on either side go. But that's really a U.S.-centric view, because this other curve here is the African church, okay? And they are very much on the traditional non-compatibilist. They can't even believe we're talking about this, okay, as an option. And so you've got a funny shape to the church. It's not just a bell curve. We're shaped like this, okay? And you can kind of locate yourself on that spectrum individually, or try to locate your church on that. We won't do that here. But you see how many people are involved. Each plan is, this is my opinion, each plan is a 2-church plan. Each plan is going to divide us into 2 groups. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's go to the next slide. Let's take the traditional plan. We say that this is what the Book of Discipline says. We're going to enforce that. And we're not going to kick out people that disagree with the Book of Discipline. But you can't defy the Book of Discipline anymore. It's not about agreement or disagreement. But if you're not going to obey the rules, then why come to our general conference and help shape the rules if you're not going to obey the rules? It's just kind of as a matter. So it draws the line between people that are willing to obey the book of discipline and people that aren't willing to obey the book of discipline. So we still have disagreement. We're not all agreed on this, but basically we've taken the people that the traditional, the progressive non-compatibilists out of the picture by making every annual conference vote. The Connectional Conference Plan is a three-body plan, a three-denomination plan, but I've argued previously that really you'd only have two because the most progressive, they join the middle one, not the most progressive. You see what I mean about that? There'd really just be two. And so you'd have annual conferences in America choosing, are we going to do same-sex weddings or not? And I think you draw the line somewhere just a little bit right of center in America. I think you'd have a good group say we're going to be in the one church kind of expression and one in the more conservative expression. Then you have the one church plan, which has no exit provision. The one church plan says it can keep us all together. I disagree with that claim because I know a lot of United Methodists that are hanging on by their fingernails saying we got to have some relief at General Conference because things have been going the wrong way for a long time. And so what you have then is a messy exit. If you don't give an exit, you run into more the Episcopal pattern, which is you got to get a lawyer to get out of this thing. And we all hope to avoid that. By the way, there's been a group of progressive, centrist, and conservative out of West Ohio that have started a movement saying the first thing that General Conference should do is create an exit ramp for those that, because somebody's going to be disenfranchised no matter what we do. So let's, you know that thing if two kids are kind of trying to split a cookie with one another, the one that breaks the cookie has to choose second, which half of the cookie they want, you know? So it's kind of that idea we ought to break up the cookie and then realize, basically, we're build a life raft, and then all of us realize we may be the ones on the life raft, you know? So make sure it's a nice life raft, make sure it's non-punitive, and you get to take your property, and you get to take your pension, and nobody's going to treat you ugly. Some people are saying that's the first thing we ought to do at General Conference is decide how we're going to treat those that are, and I think there's a little bit, that's an interesting conversation. Our bishops say, well, that's admitting defeat before you even start, but this is where we're at. So I think the plan sliced the church in different ways. Let me just give you a few things to look for, then we'll just open it up for discussion, however much time you want to spend. There are other plans, right? Because Judicial Council ruled that outside groups can submit petitions. There are 40 commission petitions. So each of the three plans have to be broken down into individual legislative actions every time you change the Book of Discipline in one place. So those three plans translate into 40 petitions. There are 18 petitions that other people submitted that were not submitted correctly. So they're kind of like they don't count. And there's 61 others that a group called the Committee on Reference have to decide if they're in keeping with the call of General Conference. If they're in keeping with the call of General Conference, Judicial Council said they have to be before the body. If not, they aren't. So they've got to decide whether they are in keeping with the call that the bishops made. There's a plan called the Simple Plan, is put forth by the Queer Clergy Caucus, which basically changes our language on human sexuality. It doesn't require constitutional amendments. There's a plan of dissolution that says the United Methodist Church should totally dissolve and then let the individual pieces figure out how they want to come together. There's an alternative one church plan with amendments. So here's some things to think about. Next month in Zurich, let's go to, there's a slide that says things to watch before February. In October, the Judicial Council will meet in Zurich, Switzerland, to rule if these plans are in keeping with our Constitution. The one church plan has at least 5 problems, maybe, with our Constitution. It delegates General Conference powers down to annual conferences. It says that bishops shall reappoint a clergy, that if the church and pastor don't feel like they're compatible, the bishop shall reappoint that pastor. It's really clear in our Constitution the bishop has power to appoint clergy, and there's no anybody else that gets anything to say about that. So I think that's a clear problem. And so we might see a batch of fixes that come out for the constitutional problems. There might be problems with the traditional plan. Probably not as many with the connectional conference plan because it already changes the Constitution. It admits that it changes the Constitution and creates amendments for that. There may be, hundreds of pages of briefs have been filed for the Judicial Council rulings next week, and you can find these online or at my blog. I've got links to all this. Under what circumstances will there be provisions for exit? This is another thing to watch. Under what circumstances will churches be required or allowed to vote on same-sex marriage? That's something to watch for. Whatever gets passed, will my local church have to vote or not? What choices will be left to annual conferences? What decisions will annual conferences have to make? Let me just say a quick word about General Conference 2019. 864 delegates, 50% clergy, 50% laity. 504 are from the U.S., 260 are from Africa, 40 are from Europe and Eurasia, 50 are from the Philippines, and 10 are from concordant churches like the Methodists in Great Britain, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and the Caribbean and the Americas. They each send two kind of dignitaries to sit in on our general conference. That's the group to be praying for. Pray for me. I'm one of the 5 clergy from our conference that will be voting on all this stuff. How to stay informed. There's a United Methodist News Service. The caucus groups issue a lot of information. There's Reconciling Ministries, which are advocating for full inclusion of LGBTQ folks in the United Methodist Church. There's the Wesleyan Covenant Association, which is more the evangelical conservative group, charismatic group. The Uniting Methodists are kind of the middle group that say, hey, let's all stay together somehow. I've got it on my blog, pinned to the top of my blog at peopleneedjesus.net. I keep a collection of everything, any news article, any blog, anything anybody's saying about the way forward, I collect it. It has like 350 links now, I think. More than you'd ever want to read, I promise you. But there's a little section in there called Recent Editions, so you can just kind of keep up with what people are writing and saying. I update it several times a week, so that's a place to go to, and there's the address there, and Gary can make sure you get that. It's just peopleneedjesus.net. That's a way to stay informed as well. Our conference newspaper has information from time to time that you can stay informed and see news and views about all this stuff. So let's talk about it now. Gary, if you questions, comments, there's...
I just comment, some of you will remember a number of years ago when the General Conference was talking about boycotting Caterpillar. And there was an enormous amount of friction in this area, and there was a lot of stuff in the media, much of which was wrong.
Yeah.
So, if you see something in the paper or the magazine, online, or whatever, and you really don't like that or something, check with Gary or Gabe or me or whatever, because it may not reflect reality at all.
Yeah, I think, we always leave General Conference, even the people that were there, we don't know what we did when we come home, because all of this legislation is in omnibus reports, and if you're not really sure what you did by the time it's kind of scary. But I think this will be less so this time because we're coming together just to talk about one issue, basically. But what the media picks up, what CNN picks up if they pick it up, probably won't reflect the nuance. The media does a terrible job of writing about religion. I mean, they just don't understand. You got to do a deep dive to even understand how the church is put together, and they're looking for a headline. That's one sentence we can grab and say this is what happened. It's almost always more complicated than that.
Just want to piggyback on that. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring this up in September, because next is November and then December, and this is February, and it's going to be here before we know it. And we wanted to have some information that is in your hands, because once it does get into the press, we're not that far from St. Louis, and we're gonna piggyback on a lot of that stuff because of our close region. So we're gonna hear maybe more about it than other regions.
I don't know about anybody else, but I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. So where might we access your PowerPoint to digest this later?
Yeah, I think Gary's going to get that to you. You can probably email it out because you got it on email, and also print version of that.
Maybe we could put that on our website. Could we do? Or how do?
Whatever you want to do. I have one hard copy here.
Well,
but
no, we can make a hard copy of his slides. We have a PDF version of that. I just couldn't get them printed in a mass volume. And it's going to be like 13 pages, I think, on the PDF.
Yeah, there's like 75 slides here. It's a little
75,
overkill. But
yeah.
There's the 95-page Commission on a Way Forward report, and that's the first link on my website there under that. Yeah, there it is. It's right there. So the compendium of updated of Way Forward stuff, if you go to that, this is awesome. And scroll down just a little bit. This is my blog. That first paragraph there's a clickable link, and that's the 95-page report that the Commission on a Way Forward put together. It has the full legislation for all three plans. That's a good, it's the cure for insomnia when you go to read it, but it really does lay everything out in a pretty comprehensive way, and then you have the other stuff I've posted there. Yeah.
Chris, we're going to have another general conference in 2020.
Which could undo everything we do in 2019.
That was the question. Can you speak at all into any of...
Yeah. So we have general conference every 4 years, and so our regular general conference is coming up in Minnesota in the summer of, in May, I guess, of 2020. And it could undo what we do in 2019. Yeah. There's a general demographic trend in the United States is Africa is going to become a bigger and bigger part of the decision making. And so I think there's a lot of people that want to see the church in a more, what they would call a progressive direction, say this is our one chance to really get this done. But 2020, we're going to probably elect from all the annual conferences we have now, and it could be a very contentious effort to try to undo what we do in 2019. Yeah. That could happen.
Seems like there's been a lot of energy and effort put into making plans that keep us under one tent, make us one church.
Yeah.
I heard you say a couple of times that even though they try to do that, it does seem like it'll be two churches. There's some people that say, you know what, we should be two churches anyway because there are irreconcilable differences. Mm-hmm. What would be, why is that not, I mean, why can't we part friends? I mean, I've heard a lot of people asking that.
Yeah, we're talking more openly about amicable separation than we ever have, but it's been such a taboo discussion. I think back in 2004, somebody got up at General Conference and said, why are we doing this to one another? Why are we arguing? Let's just create a plan to let everybody go where they feel like their conscience would lead them, and there was such a backlash against that. And, you have our bishops, and we understand our bishops are... we hear a lot about John 17, Jesus' prayer that they may all be one. And, the unity is an important Christian value. Now, we can debate on whether one of 35,000 denominations in the U.S. staying together institutionally is really what Jesus was talking about there. I think there's an argument to be made that Jesus was actually talking about something much more spiritual, and if we really put unity as the top value, let's all go be Roman Catholic, right? Because they're the biggest group of Christians, and let's just join them. If unity is the most important thing, we Protestants have an independent streak. We take a different approach to independence and freedom of religion and that sort of thing. But there are plans that definitely say this group as it's currently configured, should not be together in the way that we currently are. And institutional unity is something that, we have institutionalists in our church that draw their salary from the institution, that, and you know what, if you go to Africa, they're very pro-unity there because it works in Africa. The United Methodist Church is a well-oiled machine in Africa. They're growing leaps and bounds, and they love being United Methodist. When you visit Africa, you got the cross and flame on your car. They wave you through the checkpoint. Everybody knows what the Methodist Church is, what we stand for. It's the gold standard. And so our African brothers and sisters are saying, we're not going to vote for anything but unity, and we're not going to vote for anything but traditional sexual values. And that's an interesting thing, because a lot of U.S. evangelicals are more like, just let us do our own thing here. Let's, you can have whatever you want. You can have the general board of this, the general board of that. Just let us out of this. So unity is going to be an interesting conversation between now and during General Conference.
I think in the long run, the deciding factor is going to be how much money we want to spend to make these decisions. I mean, look at the Episcopal Church, and you said, what, $40 million or something like that? And, if you ask us, we don't have $40 million right now to spend on that.
Well, we're spending $3 million on General Conference 2019, if you're curious. It's a lot of money to get us all together, and all the translators and all the different languages, and it's a $3 million meeting.
But nonetheless, I think in the long run, it's going to just dissolve. Well,
we're facing some existential issues in the United Methodist Church of decline. We have been shrinking since 1968. Our Illinois Great Rivers Conference was a merger of Central Illinois and Southern Illinois. The entire membership of the Southern Illinois Conference is now gone. Since we merged 20 years ago, we've lost that many members it's like that whole conference just disappeared over the last generation. There's a lot for us to talk about. There's strong churches like this that are, in Geneseo that I serve, we're reaching new people for Jesus Christ. There's a lot of churches where people used to live that they're dying on the vine. We've got a lot of issues besides human sexuality to talk about.
I have two questions about February. So you've presented 3 plans. You also said there are a lot of other alternative plans. So are you considering all those plans in February? That's number one.
So we won't know which of those plans make the cut until a document comes out called the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate, which is the pre-conference publication. And so, I've got a collection of the legislation I know about on my website. I don't have it all. There's a petition to General Conference has the power to expel a bishop, and there's a petition to expel Bishop Alavito. But what we don't know is if the Committee on Reference has said that petition is in keeping with the call or not. And then any legislation can be brought up from the floor. It has to be inserted into the Daily Christian Advocate, and it has to be printed 24 hours so people can study it. So things not currently being submitted can be submitted in the process. We're only getting together for 4 days, and the first day is all worship and prayer. So there's really just 3 business days to do what we're going to do. Usually we have 2 weeks, so this is an abbreviated general conference. And some people doubt whether we can come to any kind of decision in that time. I don't know. Pray for us.
That was my next question. Whether you'd be sequestered like a jury, until you get the vote. And you're saying it's a limited time. And so,
gray smoke or white smoke come up from on the St. Louis Arch.
That would be my question. Can it happen in the time frame you're given to even come to a decision?
General Conference is such a mess. I want to close the floor to just the delegates because we got a lot to talk about here, and 865 people is enough. But General Conference 2016 was my first. And we're meeting, and here comes a group of protesters marching right through the floor of General Conference. We're having Holy Communion. Here comes somebody from the outside that sets up a queer communion station. separate from the communion we're having, so people can go over there and have queer communion, and it's just chaos. And I don't see why we do it that way. We're in a big venue. There's going to be a lot of people there. We're one of the co-hosts. Our annual conference is co-hosting with the Missouri Conference, so you can sign up to be a page or a volunteer or transportation person in general conference. But I really wish we'd just close the floor and just let's get in a room and let's figure it out. But we don't even know what the rules of general conference are going to be, because how we normally do general conference is we break into legislative committees and we work on these different legislative items and we bring it to the floor the second week. That doesn't work with this format. So there's the Commission on General Conference that's going to develop the rules for how we're going to even do this. And there's two schools of thought. One is we need to develop whole new rules. It's a whole new animal. And one is let's just make it as minimal as we can because we need to get on with it. At General Conference 2016, we spent about 3 days debating one rule. We didn't get to move forward because there was rule number 44 that we were debating. And so we spent a lot of time just debating the rules before we ever got to the actual content of the General Conference. It's a crazy way to run a church, I promise you. Every 4 years, this group of people from all around the world get together and try to figure it out. Yeah.
What do you think are the odds that nothing will happen?
37%. I don't know. I think that's one of the outcomes, and that would leave us with the book of discipline we have today, which is a traditional approach, widely ignored by some.
Will the decision of the delegates, or the vote of the delegates, be decisive and to the plan that you're going to do? I think that's quite pertinent information for this particular church. We're planning start a new phase to this church.
Yeah.
And it could make a big difference whether this church splits or not.
Well, I'm hoping that General Conference will be decisive. We've done this since 1972. It's time to decide what the United Methodist Church stands on this issue, and then what we're all going to do about that. I think most people that choose a church these days don't choose it based on the denomination. I think they choose it based on the quality of the ministry of the local church, the relationships that they have. I don't spend a lot of time. I never give this talk on Sunday morning at Geneseo. I did on a weeknight. I'm sure a lot of people that go to the church that I'm part of don't even know we're part of a denomination. They maybe see there's a Methodist on the. We don't talk a lot about it because we're trying to grow the church. We're trying to make disciples of Jesus Christ, and this tends to be a distraction. So we don't hide our United Methodist affiliation, but we sure don't. I preach Wesleyan theology in my sermons, but I don't preach Wesley would not talk about Wesley if he had a chance to stand in front of us. He would talk about Jesus. And so I try to talk about a whole lot about Jesus and the Wesleyan spirit. I don't try to convert people to John Wesley. I try to convert people to Jesus because that's what John Wesley would do. So I think if this is a strong local church, you all love one another, serving, making disciples together, I'd like to think that you'll still be doing that. After February of next year, regardless of what General Conference votes.
Yeah. Is there a place that we can go to educate ourselves about this issue and how it relates to the Bible, and so that we can understand the human sexuality and what the Bible says about human sexuality?
That's a great question. Our Cokesbury is our United Methodist Publishing House, and it's Abingdon Press, and they've done a series of books about the way forward from every perspective you could imagine. Dr. Karen Olivito, Bishop Olivito, has a book in it. Rob Renfro has a book in it. His is called "Are We Really Better Together?" He's kind of on the side of it's time to divide up and just go our own way. And there's some perspectives in the middle. So if you want a hard copy book, just kind of search Way Forward on the Cokesbury website. And they're thin books. They're not tomes. They're meant for people that just want to read up on. Some churches are having groups that are reading all those books. There's a lot of places you could go. There's if you want more of a theology, seminary textbook kind of approach, there's a lot of resources on that level. But I think a good place to start. And by the way, on my blog, I'll plug it again. Just if you go further down, there's books, and it is all the books that are written on this topic. And those are certainly you can order, maybe put in your church library, pass them around. But there's a group of pretty thin books that are all about this that Abingdon's put, and there'll be more come out between now and February. They're more like, what about this human sexuality issue? What are the biblical arguments on the pro and con side? Yeah. You all have been very patient and attentive, and this has been, I understand, if you're not exposed to this, you're kind of like, whoa, what, I didn't even know all this was going on. There's another question which we'll get to, but I guess we'll make this maybe the last question. We're coming up on the hour-and-a-half mark.
As I understand it, the delegates are the only ones who get to vote.
Yes, half clergy, half laity.
So, where does that put the regular people in this congregation? How do we let y'all know what we want?
That is a great question. So we have a delegation elected. We're a representative democracy, right? Not everybody gets to be in the Senate, but everybody gets to elect somebody that goes to the Senate. And so how your delegates were elected were at annual conference. Is the annual conference delegate here from this church? Yeah, right. We just talked about it. So this church at Charge Conference will elect lay member of annual conference. So your pastors have vote and your lay member has vote. So your church is represented in both those ways. And they will elect, when we get together in 2019, we'll be talking about what General Conference did. We'll also be electing people for 2020. And the laity vote for the laity and the clergy vote for the clergy. So pastors will run for General Conference and laity will run for General Conference. And so we're a representative democracy in that way. But what anybody can do right now is a list of the General Conference delegates are on the IGRC website, igrc.org. You can write an email to all 10 of us. We decided yesterday we'd set up one email account that's just delegation@igrc.org. I'm not sure if it's Delegation 2019 or what it'll be, but that'll be coming out in the conference news, and maybe Gary can pass it on, where you can email our whole delegation saying, here's what I think about all this. And churches are starting to do that. The leadership team of our largest church, Christ United Methodist Church in Fairview Heights, just wrote us a letter saying we think you ought to pass the traditional plan. And local churches their church council can write a letter. Individuals, any United Methodists can write a letter to the delegation. You can write a letter to all 865 delegates if you want to. It'd take a while to get all that done probably and know what the email addresses are. But probably your best bet is to the 5 clergy, 5 laity. We have alternates too, that in case one's unable to complete their work, another one steps in. You can send us what you think. We're reading all that. We're studying all that. We're talking about all that right now as a group. I don't know that we're going to change each other's votes that much. We have disagreement within our delegation, obviously, but I think it does matter. We need to hear from folks. And I hope there's a big effort about prayer around General Conference. So there's some people that are pausing at 2:23 every day in the afternoon to pray, because General Conference starts on the 23rd of February. It's 2:23. Monday is a special day of prayer each week for General Conference. There's an effort called Praying Our Way Forward. It's a companion piece to the Way Forward process that leads people in prayer. Hopefully we'll all be on our knees. What we need is the Holy Spirit to show up at General Conference 2019 and show us clearly God's will and the way to go. And maybe there's something we haven't thought of yet. This has been worked on for years and years, but maybe God has something that'll surprise us all. God does have a sense of humor, and he does love his church. Jesus didn't say he'd build our church, but he did say, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So I want to be part of that church, and I know you do too. So that's what we're trying to figure out right now. My time is up.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for letting me come and talk to you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Pastor. Bless you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming and giving of your time and what is on your heart and helping us get a bigger picture of what General Conference is about. And we really appreciate that very much. Thank you. We have a lot to pray about, don't we? One of the things that I have printed and put before you, put something in the bullet or the Footprints newsletter. Hopefully you've received that by now. It was on the back side of the calendar. It was large. 17-inch paper. It was big. But we need to be in prayer, and we will talk more about these prayer opportunities that we can do collectively as the body of Christ here as February draws near. And then the other thing is, I mentioned about to our administrative board and put this in the newsletter as well. Next month on the 14th, I'd like to get together, 4:30 that afternoon, and have some dialogue based off of what we've had here, and we can also pray together and just continue some dialogue amongst us as a church, and to have some more discussion. So we will plan on that on the 14th of February. It's just 2 weeks away. What did I say? February. I'm getting all confused here. October 14. 2 weeks. Do I have the right date, don't I, Gabe? 14th? All right, good. All right. So I'm going to let's stand where we're at. I'm going to have a prayer, and then there's some goodies out there if you want to get that on the way. By the way, again, exit that direction and either front doors or make your way down we've made a hallway past pastor's office out that door. And if anybody has a question for Chris, I'm sure you could try to answer that if best he could up here. If you want, anybody who does that, you're welcome to do that as well. So let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for your Spirit's presence among us, and we need all that you have for us. And as our brother shared with us and reminded us that this is your church, you are Lord, we're your people. We certainly welcome what you're doing and what your Holy Spirit would want to do on and through our lives. I thank you for my brothers and sisters here, and I thank you for their love for you and their desire for the things of you. And Lord, as we move forward, may help us to move forward lovingly and with you in our eyesight. And thank you for bringing Chris to us. Give him safe travel back to Geneseo and continue with the fruitfulness of his ministry there for your kingdom. And we just say we love you, and we thank you for your great love for us. And all God